Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the old masturbator, and I've been masturbating in the bathtub. I masturbate outside of the bathtub. I used to masturbate in coffee shops, like in front of everybody, and people now I have to wear a mask. They say you can't masturbate in the coffee shop unless you're wearing a mask, and I just can't do that. So I'm back to the masturbating in the bathtub and at home and in my easy chair and so forth. So today I'm kind of rushing this one through because I'm going to deal with a writer who I find really interesting and really complicated and really hard to describe. So this is we're going to do another Sui Generis. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't care. Sui Generis edition, which is a writer who I can't compare to anybody else. And I was wondering, one of the things that interests me is that of all the writers, you see all the writers we have in here, we love lots of writing, all sorts of genres, every type of writing that there is. And the writers who are more often, to my mind, sui generis, you can't compare to anyone else, are very often science fiction, particularly in the past 50 years. Now, I realize a lot of my viewers probably don't like science fiction, and I go up and down about science fiction myself. But one of the things that has been interesting to me over the years is, particularly when I was reading this stuff most in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is how different the writers were and how different stylistically and conceptually and their approaches to literature and the way they told stories. They were so wildly different. It's very hard to compare them in any way. So, and a lot of very interesting, technically brilliant writers. So, our second sui generis writer is going to be a science fiction writer, and that is someone I'm pretty sure you never heard of Christopher Priest. You should know Christopher Priest. This week we're going to talk about Doris Piserchia, or Piserchia. I've actually looked this up trying to figure out how to pronounce her name. Doris Piserchia is someone I have been reading off and on since the 70s. And I can't think of a writer to compare her to. She writes very, very strange, interesting science fiction novels. I think they can be called science fiction. They're very much they're true to the genre. Christopher Priest bends and plays with the genre quite a bit. Piserchia is very, very much indebted to the genre. She obviously likes the genre. She likes a lot of the old generic stuff. You can sort of see the A. Van Vogt. You can see Isaac Asimov. You can see the kind of old galaxy-spanning adventure writers in her work. But her work is a lot more complicated and interesting than theirs. It's also narratively some of the most unusual and tightest and strangest types of fiction I've ever read. So I'm going to give you a little pitch today about Doris Piserchia. One of the most interesting things to me was how little anyone has written about her. I'm just having a bourbon tonight because we're doing this very much last minute. She can't really, she writes completely different from anyone else. She comes along in the 70s. And early 70s, and kind of comes up and writes most of her work through the 80s and early 90s maybe. And one of the things I was fascinated to find out, I looked up her what little biographical information is around on Piserchia. She's from West Virginia. She was in the military for a few years. Everybody mentions that. And I was very startled to find she's still alive. She's 91 years young. And she stopped writing in the 80s. She hasn't written a novel, I don't think, in 40 years, or roughly 40 years. So we're going to give a big shout out to Doris. Hope you're well. We love your writing. I wanted to put her in context. So there were we've talked about 60s, 70s SF quite a bit, particularly a lot of the great women SF writers that came along in the 70s. I don't like the term feminist science fiction because I don't think any of them agree on anything, but they're all very interesting writers. We talked about Kate Wilhelm. This is one of my favorites, her short novels. We've talked about Joanna Russ, the great Joanna Russ, who certainly wrote feminist essays and would probably be most interested in the term feminist. We are going to do more on James Tiptree, the great and peculiar James Tiptree Jr., who was actually Alice Sheldon, who was she was a civil servant, possibly with the CIA, and I think she was involved in psychology or social psychology or something. A very interesting woman writer of SF. And of course, I keep leaving out Ursula K. Le Guin, the great Ursula K. Le Guin. all of these great writers were working and are still were very prominent at their time. They're increasingly significant writers over the decades. My favorite of that group, I always said, was Wilhelm, just because of the way she could, the kind of technical control she had over stories and novels, which I always admired. Piserchia is roughly of that generation, and I don't think anyone knows who she is. I don't know hardly. I talked to a couple of friends who do know her. I was glad to hear, and they feel the same way I do. They're just kind of knocked out by this writer, but she's also, there's something about her that seems like conventional science fiction, and I'll try to explain what I mean by that. I just read this week the Fluger. It sounds terrible. Look at that horrible cover. Well, it's actually a beautiful cover, but it's a giant monster, which is actually the monster in the book. It's called a Fluger. And then there's a couple of people in this futuristic Earth society. And it's about again, this is like an old A.E. Van Vogt book, but much more controlled and much better put together. This creature comes to Earth. It's from some super dense planet. And basically it's a killing machine. It can kill and loves to kill, and it enjoys killing. And it's the book... Large parts of the book are these just slaughter scenes where this animal just goes through this society killing everything it can find. They're actually quite funny scenes. She's a very funny writer. And it's a nightmarish world that Piserchia sees. I mean, she does see a future world filled with scientific marvels and at the same time run by animals. Animals from other planets and animals on our planet. There's all sorts of problems with this world. You have there's Olympus, which is a mountainous world for the wealthy, and then there's the slums, where one of the characters, and I keep forgetting his name, I forget. There's so many characters. A young black kid who's 13, at the beginning is his grandfather's killed, and he's half blinded by this monster who's going on a wild rampage, and he decides he's going to go kill this creature. Now, that sounds terrible. I'll be the first to say, that sounds like a terrible book. It sounds ridiculous. Every single sentence and chapter and scene is narratively interesting. It is controlled. She's very objective, so she always stays objective about crazy events. She often goes into the personality and the point of view of these crazy aliens. There's 2 or 3 different aliens in this book, including the Fluger. And she writes really well from its point of view as just something that loves to kill and explaining why it likes to kill. She also, in this one small book, 160 pages, there's probably 10 or 12 significant characters in it. And she moves around so quickly that you have to really be paying attention. Now, it's not experimental. It's just that she uses narrative techniques as well as she possibly can, and it's completely unusual. The way she tells stories, the way we follow along with all the different characters going in different directions, eventually converging on this big nightmarish scene where there's an alien gunslinger that comes to town to try to kill the Fluger. And it's 3 creatures. It's a composite of 3 different creatures. I can't really describe a brief Piserchia novel. This is one of her last books. This was published in 1980. And I think she wrote 1 more book after this, or 2 more books after this. And then she went silent. And according to the biographical information, she had family issues and she wanted to take care of her grandchildren or something like that. Her first book was Star Rider. I read this when it came out in the early 70s. Really strange, haunting. Just she can do in a scene, in 1 page, some phantasmagorical interstellar adventure, and then come back down to another and go somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else. I remember enjoying that. Her first book actually was not that. It was an ace double called Mr. Justice. I haven't read this one, but I think we'll try to take that in the bathtub soon. And it's interesting to me because here's this weird form of literature, which is the old ace double. They did the thrillers, they did cowboy, they did westerns, and they did science fiction. And a lot of good writers came out of there. But her main success, the great Frederick Pohl edited a wonderful series for Ballantine, and he did her first 2 novels with her, 2 substantial novels, A Billion Days of Earth. And most of these books take place, like the Fluger, in a really far future. It's almost science fantasy, way in the super future like the Time Machine, Eloy period, way millions of years in the future, where all sorts of alien creatures and strange things are happening, and the human creature is even strange, is the strangest of them all, and the most nightmarish. I mean, even again, these inequalities of the upper crust and the lower crust in the Fluger, through which this creature rampages. It doesn't care who it kills. It doesn't care who it kills. It is haunting, funny, very funny writer, and she doesn't waste a sentence. I wanted to read some passages, but I probably won't. I mean, this has gone too long. But all these old DAW pictures, DAW paperbacks have these really weird covers, which you might be tempted to avoid, and you shouldn't. They always have some weird alien creature on the cover. So I won't talk too much more about that. I want to read a brief passage from an early Frederick Pohl we're going to talk a little more about Pohl. Is not one of the most interesting science fiction writers to me. I've always had trouble reading him, but he worked with the great C.M. Kornbluth, and they wrote some great stuff together. And C.M. Kornbluth was one of the real tragedies of science fiction. He died very young, and he was a very, very talented writer. His most famous piece was The Marching Morons. And if you've not read The Marching Morons, you should rush out and read it. Anyway, Pohl was really at his best as an editor. And for many years, he helped produce and published lots of good writers. And he was one of the first people to publish Doris Piserchia, who I guess was a neighbor. And at one point in this year's best science fiction for 1972, I pulled this out. And he said some things about her. He says, never met her. He says, she grows as she writes. I don't know where she will be 10 years from now, or if her name will automatically bring in readers, or if she will have a cluster of awards on her shelves. No one can tell about things like that. So much of what happens to writers is chance and good luck or bad. I do know that if talent and energy and willingness to learn will do it, you will be hearing a lot more of Doris Piserchia. And of course, the truth of the matter is those qualities don't necessarily make people famous. Lots of horrible writers are famous now who did not have an ounce of the talent of Doris Piserchia. So we're going to be reading more of her work in the bathtub. I really wanted to talk about this one quickly because the Flugers, as a late book. Another thing is, as one of the few times I've checked out a writer in the Science Fiction Encyclopedia by my good friend John Clute and the late Peter Nichols, I almost always agree with them, but they did say something about how the late Piserchia, she starts to lose a little energy. She loses no energy. This is one of her last books. Amazing book, amazing piece of fiction, and it's so much happening in it that you can't miss it. You can't miss a beat, and all the way up to the last sentence. There's no repetition. There's no these long segues. It's not like a Stephen King novel where the dog is trying to break into the car for hundreds and hundreds of pages. It's constantly shifting and moving forward, and always surprising you. And anything she's written was worth reading. And she's still out there. So Doris, get back to work. We miss you out here in the bathtub. And anyone who is interested in science fiction and is not you have to be unashamedly interested in completely wild, futuristic science fiction. Then you will find a writer who does everything with a great deal of intelligence and originality. Sui generis. There's no one else like Doris Piserchia that I can think of, and I can't even imagine someone else writing the wonderful books that she wrote. This is a little brief love letter to Doris Piserchia. We're going to read more of you. I've read her over the years. I can't even remember the stuff. There's so much happening in those books that I kind of have to do one book at a time. And we'll take them. And you also can't do too many. You have to do like one every 6 months because you really need to kind of re-energize for that particular intelligence that was in her work. All right. Happy bathing. Happy masturbating. You go masturbate in any coffee shop you want. I'm not going to call anybody. And I think you should please yourself. Please yourself. Masturbate. Bye.